So welcome everyone to our discussion around empathy, trust and competence. Delighted to have you join us for the next 45 minutes. So those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Tobias. I'm the Managing Director and Founder of the Strategy Group. Again, if you're not quite sure who the Strategy Group is, we focus on 5 pillars that you can see. Innovation, which has been our heartland for many years. Very strong focus at the moment on customer experience. Everyone's looking at how do we actually put the customer at the center? How do we take an outside-in view of strategy of the customer, of empathizing with the customer, of customer experience and user experience design? We've been focused very much on business strategy with a number of our clients, and of course, business strategy today involves digital strategy. And last but not least, we've seen a strong interest in employee experience. As people are moving back to the office or not moving back to the office, depending on what's happening in the organization. It's not just about the experience for the corporates and saving money by office space, but what is that employee experience? What is that experience that's going to delight the employees in your organization? So Martin, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself and public purpose.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Nice to be here. Good to see you. Good to see a few folks that I know and a few others on the call. So Martin Stewart-Weeks is my name. I run an advisory practice called Public Purpose. We could perhaps unpack that a little bit later in the day. It really reflects 2 or 3 strands of my career over quite a long period now. Public policy would be one of those, and I had a stint in Canberra some years ago, which ended up in a ministerial office as a chief of staff and then doing policy work inside the public service. Quite a deal of interest in public sector management and leadership, and a whole chunk of work that's come there. And then I guess the third piece that's a little bit more recent, but certainly a very significant part of the work I do is the digital piece. I spent some years, in fact, that's where Jeff and I first met, working for Cisco, the big internet company, working in the strategy and innovation side, I have to say, not so much in the deep technical side, although I learned a hell of a lot about networks, and that was a good thing to do. And I'm now back running my own practice, but kind of works at the intersection between policy and management and technology, I guess, and always with an overlay of innovation, exactly. So great to be here.
Yeah, Martin, welcome. Great to see you. So if you recall, about 2 years ago, just after the pandemic hit us all, yeah, we had a similar discussion around what we're talking about today, empathy, trust and competence, etc. And at that point, I remember vividly we were talking about how well our leaders, our government leaders, our corporate leaders were faring, how well they were, empathizing with all of us as citizens, how well they were demonstrating competence and making decisions, rapid decisions that would normally take 2 years in the space of 2 days and 3 days. I guess this concept of empathy, trust, competence, before we sort of delve into where we are 2 years later, which I think is the sort of nub of our discussion today, just give us a bit of a refresher. Why empathy, trust, competence? What is ETC?
Yeah, let me do that in just a minute. I just want to say a quick word about my background picture here, which is Coogee Beach. I'm trying to remember what it looked like when it wasn't pouring with rain, and also let me use that as a good excuse to recognise and respect and acknowledge traditional owners of the land on which I am, which is Gadigal land here in of the Eora Nation, and pay respect, as we always like to do, past, present, and rising. Look, Jeff, let's go back a step. The game here is all about trust. This is where you and I seem to recall, started this conversation, certainly my own thinking about this. And it's not a particularly blinding insight, but it's a kind of important one to start with, I think. The currency in the end of good government, the only currency in the end of good government is trust. So the question is, where does that come from? Now, people have spent literally careers and entire PhD theses and large libraries around the world writing and explaining where they think trust comes from. But I, in my head, just boil it down to 2 factors. And of course, it's not that simple, but actually in some respects, I think it is that simple. Trust comes from the combination of a couple of things. The first is competence. It's a pretty obvious observation to make that, generally speaking, the people we trust, the people we tend to feel confident about being around, whether it's somebody to, fix your heart if you're in trouble, if you've got a health problem, or somebody to fix your roof if your roof is leaking, you tend to go with people who seem to know what the hell they're doing. So competence is a kind of bedrock issue, I think, about where trust comes from. But the second issue that I think is crucial and has been an interesting factor in the last 2 years in particular is this notion of empathy, the ability to stand in the shoes, if you like, of the other, for governments to be able to have a really practical but also genuine and authentic sense about what the lives of the citizens that they're trying to help actually are like. And it seems to me, if you put empathy and competence together, if you can get that combination going well, you know what you're doing, you're good at what you do, you deliver what you say you're going to deliver, and you ground that in a really deep sense of understanding the lives and the conditions of the people you're trying to help and support, not surprisingly, the third part of that triangle, trust, starts to grow. And of course, the great thing about it is, as that triangle feeds into and off each other, you show competence, you show some empathy, you grow the trust, you get a greater sense of allowing yourself to do more, and the citizens will allow you to do more, and so on and so forth. So you get that nice cycle. So that's kind of where it comes from, because at the end of the day, as I say, I think the game is all about trust. It has always been about trust. And I think in the last couple of years in particular, we've seen an interesting narrative in that space.
What do you think happens if we pull one of those elements out of that triangle?
Yeah, I think by definition, the cycle doesn't work. The system doesn't work. Exactly. So if you're terribly empathetic and spend a lot of time, talking with people and being incredibly sort of acknowledging people's, pain or hurt or whatever it might be, or indeed the opportunity they're trying to realize, but you can't actually get the job done. You can't get their problem solved, and you can't actually find ways of making programs and services that you then work. In the end, the fact that you're, very helpful and acknowledging them and being terribly empathetic isn't going to get you any very far. Similarly, there isn't any point, I think, being super competent and just getting the job done and getting on and doing it if you're drifting away from a sense about where people want you to be and how people want you to behave. So my sense is those things are tightly locked together. And yeah, I think if you do one on their own or try and take anything out of that equation, by definition, the equation doesn't work.
So, I'm interested. Well, first of all, please, this is meant to be a discussion over the next 40 or so minutes. So please put comments, questions in the chat, and we'll definitely look to come to them. So please join in the conversation. So Martin, if we look back over the past couple of years, what has experience taught us around these three ideas and how they're connected? What do you think?
Yeah, great point. And gosh, haven't we all been thinking, perhaps not in quite these terms, but I've certainly been given a lot of thought. I think two things. It's taught us that, and it perhaps is an oversimple equation. I'll be interested if other people on this call think perhaps we're boiling this down too much. But nonetheless, these three ideas and their interrelationship are in fact at the heart of good government done well. I think what I've seen, what I've experienced, what I've learned from senior public servants, other commentators and analysts, and my own work, my own kind of reflection I expose as a citizen as well as a professional in this space with some interest, I just think it said to me, yeah, these three elements are tightly locked together. That's the first thing it's reinforced to me. Second thing it's reinforced to me is it's quite easy for that equation to be disturbed and upset. My sense, quickly going back over those couple of years, and frankly, let's face it, the game is not over just yet in any way. And of course, just for good measure, we now have a European war to kind of keep us, unsettled and a little bit disturbed. And gosh, isn't that a difficult set of circumstances? But the last couple of years, I think, have been a bit of a roller coaster to some extent about how well those three elements have been kept in place by governments. That's kind of where I'd come to. Do you feel the same thing? It seems to me that's probably where we've gone. It's been a bit up and down.
I think it's been very up and down. It's been a huge roller coaster. And I think if we again reflect back on our discussion, it was an exceptionally positive discussion. What we were seeing,
wasn't it, at that time? Yeah.
In fact, I think we talked about how government is well ahead of the corporate sector in their ability to make decisions, act on decisions, and even decisions that some of which failed. For example, if you think about the COVID app, the federal app, whether you can argue whether it was a good thing or bad thing, it's immaterial. There was a decision taken. Let's build an app. Let's give it a go. Let's try and make this work. Did it work in the end? Probably not, as the way it was envisaged. Was it the right thing to do at the time? Absolutely. Would that app have been created in sort of, peace times, normal time? Probably not.
And it would have taken longer, probably. I might say it's a great point you've just made, because it's an important point to add to this notion of competence. I think the notion of competence, particularly in complex and contested periods, and let's face it, 1 in a 100-year pandemic, these were slightly unusual times, to put it mildly. I don't think the notion of competence means you can't make mistakes. I don't think the notion of competence means that you don't go off and try some stuff and maybe rapidly realize that what you tried isn't quite right and you adjust and all the rest of it. I think there's been good evidence that suggests, and actually what you've just described, the app is a good one, that sometimes you have to move relatively fast without all the facts, almost inevitably. And the notion of competence doesn't mean, this sense that you're going to get everything perfectly right. In fact, to some extent, the notion of competence, and I don't know how you feel about this, is wrapped up with the notion of taking sensible and intelligent risks, because the circumstances in which you operate require you to move and to get going. And you have to be prepared to some extent in a competent kind of way to maybe take some steps that you're not absolutely certain are going to be right or perfect, but that they have to be done. I don't know, again, how you feel about that. And again, I think our conditions of the last couple of years has given us some good evidence about when we've done that quite well, and perhaps when we actually haven't done that all that well, and we have actually been witnessing a certain amount of, I wouldn't call it incompetence, but certainly a lack of capability to follow through. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the days of planning something to the nth degree over, countless meetings and multiple PowerPoint slides backed up by countless Excel spreadsheets are gone. I think the notion of we have to give it a go. We have to get out and do something. And yes, it may not work quite the way we want to. In fact, it may not work at all. But the fact that we've, done the rapid experiments, we talk about rapid experiments to our clients, thinking like an entrepreneur, thinking like a startup. I've got 6 weeks. I've got to do this because the world's going to end if I don't. And in many instances over the past couple of years, we've seen the need for that. And I think that has actually worked really well. So I guess my question to you, Martin, is is it going to continue? I mean, is this mindset of giving it a go, rapid experimentation, whether it succeeds or not? And what do you think some of the frustrations are around continuing that mindset moving forward?
Yeah, that is a key question, clearly. Because to some extent, this is touching on an issue that, again, I've discussed with a number of people. You and I have chatted about this a few times, but I have too, including with some folks who are on this call. But more generally, this idea of what I would describe and did describe for a while as the COVID dividend. Like, we've learned how to work in ways which are quite unusual and actually can be quite successful. The question is, do we keep doing that, or do we regress to some extent as the emergency conditions recede? To ways of working which perhaps are perhaps not quite so agile, perhaps not quite so intelligently risk focused, and so on. So a couple of the frustrations, I think one of them, in my view, is this sense that how we've learned to operate relatively fast, often great intensity, and with a deal of what, again, I would call intelligent risk taking, that we are actually the danger is that we will allow that to go back to being a little bit more cautious, a little slower, and I think to some extent lose the benefit of that ability to do things relatively quickly, rapidly learn, adjust, and keep adjusting. It's a very powerful way of working, which strikes me we've got to find a way of sustaining. Otherwise, we will, I think, lose the benefit of the way in which that cycle is a fabulous way to learn, and learn rapidly. And it strikes me we are now working in a set of conditions in the world, frankly, regardless of pandemics and European wars, where the speed with which you learn is fundamentally your most serious strategic, both weapon, if you like, and defense. So speed of learning, we did that. My goodness, did we do that in ways that almost phenomenal. So one of my frustrations is I sometimes get a bit of evidence that some aspects of our public sector leadership, and I think some of our political class too, are looking to wind that back a bit. And sort of, that was fine, while it was a pandemic, but honestly, we can't live like that, because that's just not good. We need to go slower. I think a couple of other quick frustrations. I think there has been the most astonishing level of collaboration across the so-called silos in ways that we always call for, but we very rarely seem to see, or not as often as we'd like. And yet I've got first-hand evidence from folks who've been inside the machine doing, 17-hour days, 8 days a week. There's the amazing amount of data that was shared, people that was shared, leadership concerns that sort of seemed to go out the window because we were all focused on a common, all that stuff. Where the hell is that going to go? That can't disappear. Surely it can't disappear. You and I were talking a little earlier, a couple of days ago, as we were preparing for this conversation. I was sharing with you what I often hear from public servants who tell you what it's like working in any sort of emergency, including the ones we've got right now, right? 150-year floods in Brisbane and what we're having here in New South Wales. And they'll tell you, fantastic, what the public sector and the public space can do under emergency conditions is quite remarkable. And yet somehow or other, it all seems to dissipate the minute the floods recede and the fires are out and so on and so forth. So that's a big frustration for me. And the last one, I think, too, is quite often we do know the solution to problems, or at least we know elements of the solution, and yet we seem to find it difficult often to put them into operation, because some of those solutions require us to think about how power and authority is distributed, how data is distributed, how we engage with citizens. And yet constantly we get these little windows, or big windows in the case of COVID, where we know we can do this stuff. We know we can do this stuff better and quicker and faster and more effectively. And yet sometimes the sort of natural inclination to be a bit more timid, to be a little bit more uneasy with that way of working seems to suddenly take over. And I think those are some frustrations which I'm already getting a sense of. I'd be interested if there are folks on this call, either corporate or people in government, whether perhaps you've had a little bit of evidence like that already inside your own organisations. What do you think?
Well, there's a great question here from Narelle Kennedy, and I think if we take us back to pre-pandemic times, what was the call for most businesses? What was the thing? And Narelle's made this point. I'll come to her question in just a minute. But we used to say of government, what we really want government to do is get out of the way. Remember that phrase?
Yes.
They would just get out of the way.
Yeah. And Ronald Reagan told us that government was the problem, not the solution.
The government was the problem, not the solution. And that got turned on its head come 2020, where we were really amazed at the solutions that the government was coming up with. So Narelle asked this question, how does this triangle, right, ETC, relate to the call for government to get out of the way and the hollowing out of the public sector expertise as a consequence? Great question.
It's a brilliant question. It's at two things. It's good to see Narelle on the call. I've known Narelle for a while, and a very acute observation. It's at this issue, of course, is at the heart of the really big piece of work that many people on this call will know that David Thodey and his team led into the independent review of the Australian Public Service, which was reported last year, recently. And I think what we've learned in the last couple of years is that we have reached a point where, if you like, almost a sort of an ideology of what I would call just-in-time government and just-in-time response to a lot of issues, including, therefore, the investment, or what appeared to be the investment in capability and skill when you didn't appear to immediately need it, particularly has actually reached now a really risky level. And we suddenly found that we are relying on public systems in particular, which are, one could argue reasonably fragile in their ability to actually find both the expertise, the skill, the depth, and often the historical knowledge that is required then to deal with a current problem. So answering Narelle's point, I think the triangle assumes that the rediscovery, which I would argue we've witnessed in the last 2 years, of the virtue and values of good, solid public work, why good government done well actually matters. I think we've rediscovered that. I think does suggest that we need to rethink quite dramatically how we invest in the long-term capability and expertise of the public service itself, but also, if I can put it like this, a sort of public purpose capability, because sometimes, of course, that's also engaging the corporate world, it's engaging the NGO world, of course, and very much engaging our philanthropic sector. But I agree, I think Narelle's hit at least one of the nails on the head there, that I think we've come to a bit of a sudden, we've had a bit of an aha moment, I think. Now, the question is what we're going to do about that. And, you know, there are arguments that suggest, well, you know, we're about to go into a very difficult financial situation. You know, we've got debt coming out of our ears. You know, we all read the papers. We all read the arguments from all sorts of parts of the ideological spectrum about where and how we're going to recoup some of that. And therefore, you know, spending more money on building, you know, capability inside the public service may not be a very easy cause to prosecute. But I think it's going to be crucial because it's critical to at least the way in which that triangle that we just talked about works.
Yes, no, I couldn't agree more. And I'm just thinking as you're talking, I hope that as we move into the next two cycles of electioneering, that we don't move, we don't lose that empathy, you know, the trust and the confidence. And a year later, we're having a conversation like this thing, gee, it would be really good if government would get out of the way, but, you know. So, but I think your point about not falling back to where we've been is really important.
I think that's the key.
It is the key. Torero has raised an interesting question around, maybe I'm putting words in his mouth, but whether in fact this triangle should be a square. So his question is on authenticity, which I think is a really important word.
I saw that word. Yeah.
How much of it is evidence, and how important is empathy, trust, and important in how empathy, trust, and competence show up?
Look, it's a bedrock issue. It's a great word to raise here, I think. No, there's no question. The first thing I'd say is that, in my experience, having been in this game on and off for quite a long time, sometimes on the political side, but mostly on the professional and bureaucratic side, I sense that we are in a period where there is less and less ability to fake authenticity. You remember the line, I think it's a very famous line from a Groucho Marx movie, you know, that if you've got to the point where you can fake authenticity, you've got it made, I think he says, and then, you know, taps his cigar and moves off. It is a great line, and it's a very funny line, but it's also quite painful, because it seems to me, if you're going to play the empathy card, and we're arguing, I think, in our conversation here, and I think you and I have been tossing this around for a bit now, that actually it is part of the game, you cannot play it unless you turn up with an authenticity that can be tested and can be interrogated and can be found to be genuine. Because if it is tested and interrogated, in much the same way I might suggest, sorry to bring this in right now, although I think we you know, not unreasonably, I think what's happening with the way people are reacting to President Zelensky in Ukraine is that this is a guy that seems to have actually bucket loads of authenticity. I don't think what he's doing is particularly faked. I don't think he's kind of playing. Now, I know he's an actor. I get all that. I get his background and a stand-up comedian. So who knows? Maybe he's cracked the Groucho Marx code here, and he's just brilliantly faking his authenticity. But I don't think so. The other thing I think too, you sense is that when leaders turn up and are genuinely empathetic, as opposed to putting it on, they will start getting people to follow them.
Yeah.
So my sense is that the test of authenticity, to some extent, is a function of what I would call followership. In other words, people tend to stick with leaders who they find reasonably authentic, at least over the long term. Sometimes you do stick with people who are kind of handy and, you know, might have a short-term gain that you think you're going to get out of it, but largely we don't do that. And I think we increasingly don't do that. I think we're increasingly skeptical. So it's a great point.
I think if let's extend that a bit to Zelensky. I mean, it's not only authenticity, but if you look at empathy, trust, and competence, I mean, he's standing there being authentic, but saying we are not going to give up. We are going to, you know, in the war clothes, in the khaki, in the stuff, you know, with
khaki t-shirt.
So you can't ask for much more authenticity and empathetic views as he's got. And then trust. I mean, if you listen to, and I don't know, maybe it's fabricated by the media, but you listen to all the interviews. You know, we're going to follow Zelensky. We are here. We're not going to give up. We're going to fight for the country. And in terms of competence, well, you know, hopefully the media is right in that, you know, the Russian invasion is being slowed. But I mean, who would have thought that, you know, Ukraine could have in fact done what it's done even to date? You know, hopefully, who knows what happens in the future in terms of competence. And to your point, Martin, you know, I just listening to the news this morning about how the Australian government now has to warn people who want to go from here to Ukraine about the dangers, because
Yeah.
there's this mass of people who now want to actually
Yeah.
fly to a war zone
Yeah.
to be part of his movement, you know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's huge. The other thing he does a lot, of course, and good leaders do this, as we know. And again, you can fake this, but people quickly work it out if you are faking it. He uses the word we and us a lot.
Or a lot.
Seems to me, if you listen to what he's saying and how he's saying it, he's basically saying, there's only one place for me to be right now, and that's right in the middle of this crisis. So perhaps unlike a few other leaders, when the crisis turns up, they literally in some cases, hop on a plane and fly to somewhere else, or at least in other ways sort of seem to disappear from the front line. He seems to me to be suggesting that the only authentic and therefore empathetic place to be is actually in the middle of this fight with the people he represents. Now, look, it's an extreme situation. We all know that. Gosh, heaven knows what must be going on in both his mind and in the lives of so many people in the middle of in the Ukraine at the moment. It really is quite distressing. But to the extent we can use that as a very, very powerful and very extreme, perhaps, example of what we're talking about, I think it's powerful. One might perhaps speculate that we're seeing a little bit less of those conditions on the other side of the fence. With a fellow who's sitting on the end of a very long table in the middle of Moscow. In fact, it occurred to me, it suddenly realized to me, I read today that, I'm sorry, this is a slight sidebar, but one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin keeps meeting people at the end of these enormously long tables is because he's actually extremely frightened about catching COVID. This is now the new story. This is his COVID strategy. He just doesn't want to be close to anybody. Anyway, that's slightly irrelevant.
Well,
but in all seriousness, there's a very different story coming from Moscow at the moment, it seems.
Well, if you take the two words empathy and trust,
yeah,
and you say, can you empathize with someone and can you trust them at the end of a very long table? I think the answer is you can't. So what is effectively
slightly
saying,
anxious,
I am not going to empathize with you and I don't trust you. Otherwise, I'd put you at the table much closer to me. Who knows? But
anyway,
I think it's look.
It's an interesting
it is
physical and visual signal.
Visual signal and compare that to Zelensky's videos of all the people standing around him, nodding, going, "Yes, we are here."
We're right here with you, mate.
You know,
totally.
Very interesting perception. Anyway. So look at the interesting question from William Murphy, as we both, William, thank you. William, and
glad William's on the call.
Who's been in the middle of the COVID communication space over the past couple of years. So he writes and asks the question, when the whole government moved from its traditional silo to, as he puts it in inverted commas, Department of COVID, you have to love it, Department of COVID, so many long-standing barriers to data sharing, joint investment and collaboration disappeared. This new way of working will not naturally stay in place post-COVID unless we deliberately act to retain in the interests of a compelling and collective business case, and the structures and processes of government are realigned to incentivize this collaboration. Does this require a rethink of ministerial portfolio and budgetary alignment? How long have we got?
I was just going to say, can I just say yes and move on? I mean, sorry, that's a brilliant question, of course, and it's a topic that I know William and his colleagues spend a lot of their time talking about, and I certainly have. Let me go. I'll go sideways to answer it or respond to it or reflect on it, because I think the answer fundamentally is what's being illustrated here at the moment is the mismatch between the nature of the problems and opportunities to some extent we are now asking our public sector and our public servants to face, and much of the machinery with which they have to do that work, and it's not in sync. Sidebar, if I could, but it's relevant. Just bear with me for 60 seconds. Yesterday, I was listening to a podcast from the Institute for Government in the United Kingdom, and it was the annual director's lecture. And the director is a very impressive former public servant called Bronwyn Maddox. And the title of her speech was "What's Wrong with the British Government?" And I listened to the whole 40-minute speech. I was doing some driving around yesterday and some other things that allowed me to tune in. And apart from the fact that her answer was quite a lot, as in quite a lot of things are wrong with the British government, not just the fact that, you know, we have a prime minister who's slightly at odds with the rule of law at the moment around parties and so on, put that to one side. But her fundamental point goes to William's question. And what she argued in the last 10 minutes of her speech was that in many respects, the constitutional and governance machinery in the United Kingdom is no longer fit for purpose. It's actually not helpful for people who are trying to do the things that William has adverted to in his question, and that in a sense we're arguing with here, which is to deal with a whole slew of risks and opportunities, particularly in the digital age, that no longer fit comfortably in the silos and structures of the way we set up ministries, the way we set up and task ministers themselves. Certainly they don't fit very comfortably with the way we allocate money, hold people accountable for spending that money, and also create a proper balance of power between the executive branch of government and the parliamentary and legislative branch of government, which to some extent many scholars will tell you, and I'm not one of them, I read a lot of them, but I'm not a scholar of this space, but will tell you that in fact that space of our government has actually been considerably undermined in the last 20 years or so in terms of its capacity to properly hold governments to account. So Bronwyn's answer, as I say, I'm going sideways to answer or reflect on what William has raised, is that yes, we have reached the stage, and the pandemic has absolutely brought this into very, very sharp and stark relief, that we need to go back and slightly, well, no, in some cases slightly, in some cases substantially, rewire many of these elements. I'll give you one other quick example, and it's very much in William's bailiwick, and he'll know obviously the example I'm going to use, and that is the way in which his own minister, Dominello, here in New South Wales, has been assiduously working on shifting the way we create budgets for and account for the way we invest in technology and digital projects, to try and get them away from this lumbering, cumbersome, slow, and often incredibly unhelpful procurement game that we then ask agile, experimental projects to go through and then wonder why the hell they don't work. So to be fair and to absolutely give credit where it's due, both to William and to others in his team and his colleagues, I think we're trying very hard in this state, at least in one slice of the point that William is raising, to actually say, yeah, we've actually got to rewire some of this stuff. We can't keep asking people to, as it were, go into battle with a whole series of weapons and systems that just don't fit the context in which those battles are being held. So yeah, we do need some really quite fresh thinking. Now, you could argue about whether we're going to get any at the moment, given that we all seem to be very busy, A, fighting elections, B, worrying about the next emergency. But I would like to think that the next year or two might see at least some experiment and some effort to start coming to grips with the systemic level that I think William has adverted to very helpfully and exactly at the right moment.
Yeah, no, excellent. When you talk about what we're worried about, you mentioned a few things. I think the other thing that we seem to be worried about at the moment is the whole return to work issue.
Yeah. And
I wonder whether this notion of empathy, trust, and competence applies not just in the public sector, but also in the corporate sector. And
yeah, I wonder,
is there something in this around, this continual debate around, are we in the office, are we at home, are we in the office, are we remote? Who's it good for? Is it good for the employee? Is it good for the employer? Yeah. Maybe we're not empathetic enough and trusting enough. And what do you think?
Well, let me start the ball rolling, because I've got a view that you may want to just push back on a little. And I'm also interested, I think your point about the corporate sector and many of these conversations is interesting. You're, in a sense, much closer to that. The strategy group does a lot more work in that space. I quite like the way in which you guys often cross over between kind of corporate experience and government experience, because I think there is a lot to be learned from that. But let me start the ball rolling by saying my gut instinct is that we are seeing a little bit of what I would call leadership lack of empathy. This notion that it's going, right, we're all back in the office. I don't really care. I don't really care that you guys have managed to find really interesting and actually quite productive ways of blending different ways of working, including from home. But then, that's all over. That was the pandemic. 5 days a week, 8 till 6 in the office. Honestly, if I can't see you, I don't trust you, all that kind of stuff. That does seem to me to be a terrible waste of what I would call the dividend of the last 2 years. Do you think that's fair starting point? Maybe it's too simple on its own, but that's where I'd start. Have a think a little bit about where your people have been. In many cases, what amazing sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? How creative they've been to find new rhythms and patterns that turn out to be really quite productive, quite helpful. Surely to goodness, we should be at least starting with a predisposition to keep some of that as we move into the next phase. Do you think, where do you, and what's your experience in the corporate world?
Look,
Where are they going
I
to?
agree with you. I mean, I'm just thinking as you're talking, if you think about it, we talk about rapid experiments and thinking quickly. It's effectively what we've all done. I mean, if you think about the whole work from home,
yeah,
it's one big experiment for a lot of people, and people have run experiments, whether it's, they're from their lounge room, with their family, with their dogs, how they work, how they dress, what they do, how they eat, how they relate with each other from the office. There's been lots of mini experiments been going on. And I think your point, Martin, we've got to make sure that doesn't go away anymore. And that
we can't just discount all that, I think. Yeah, exactly.
The 5-day week, 8 to 6 in the office.
Yeah.
But, and I think the other point you made about, if I don't see you, I don't trust you. And I think in the public sector, and also in the semi-private or semi-corporate sector and the corporate sector, that a lot of that was there. If I can't see you at your desk, then you're not working. And so, I don't trust you. So again, if we bring empathy, trust, competence, I trust you to do whatever you do. And, when we were at Cisco, that was the way we worked. I mean, we were all global. There weren't offices that people were in because everyone was on airplanes or out meeting.
What an interesting thought.
So you had to empathize with people and how they work, trust them, and know that they were competent to actually carry out.
Hold that competence to account, by the way.
And hold
which
that
is fine.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
good point.
And I think it's been interesting to look at some examples of where empathy, trust, competence has really focused and come out from the corporate world. I mean, one quick example, you may or may not agree, maybe you shop at Coles, I don't know. But I mean, if you look at, for example, Woolworths and the messages coming out of Woolworths during the pandemic, from Brad Banducci around, we're here, we're trying our best, we're working hard. It's been, the communication was really excellent around, we're part of you, we've got employees who have to eat like you do, all of the above. I think there's been some really interesting examples, and also examples of organizations that have had to pivot really quickly because of the pandemic. I mean, one very quick one that springs to mind is a company called Stage King. So Stage King's big producer of stages, big outdoor events. Pandemic hit, business goes to zero, and they start to think, what can we do? What are we competent at? What do people need from an empathy perspective? And they said, what people need are desks at home. So they've now built a huge business around furniture for the home and for the office. There was a pivot from where they were. And again, empathizing, understanding, looking where they're competent, and knowing that people, because they've got that legacy and would trust them. So I think there's a lot of parallels between what we're talking about in the public service and the public.
I just wanted to
private.
Yeah, sorry. I know we're a bit short for time. That's great. I think that's really powerful, and I think there are some very important, because I think what we're all waking up to is that they're actually quite powerful. This is a sort of future of work conversation, I guess, that tends to straddle right across sectors. I think we're all waking up to the fact that there's some quite powerful shifts going on here about what organisations do and how they actually organise themselves, and I think they're quite powerful. They were probably happening, frankly, before COVID, but they've certainly been accentuated. I just wanted to pick up this last quick comment from Leonie here about the flip side of this kind of way of autonomous and sort of flexible working, particularly around young people. I think it's a very, very fair point, and I think it's certainly incorrect and would not be very empathetic to assume that everybody across your entire workforce, particularly younger, relatively new workers into the more formal workforce, have somehow already developed both a sense of connection, a sense of collegiality, a sense of community. Because for many of them, the first jobs they've ever had have actually been online for the last 2 years. And certainly I'm very well aware of some work that I've been doing recently where, I think some of our younger team members, and I'm talking those broadly speaking under 30 or in that space, have actually found the experience really quite difficult. So I think it's a great comment to make, because I think we've got to be careful about sort of overdoing this notion that it's all fabulous and lovely and we can all have this great, for a lot of people it's not fabulous and lovely and it's quite difficult, and they don't feel necessarily deeply connected therefore to the culture and workforce that they're part of. So I think we have to be careful about how we calibrate that balance between the two. But I'm glad it was raised, because I think it's a very real problem, and I'm conscious of the fact that we're a little short of time, but I thought that was worth pulling out.
Yeah, no, it is. Absolutely. No, thank you. So in the last couple of minutes that we have, Martin, 2 or 3 takeaways of what what should our leaders do to keep bringing this ETC back in and from it's not escaping us?
I'm going to make 2 quick comments. One of them's actually about the whole issue of talent and expertise, which goes right back to Narelle's comment right at the beginning of this little chat. I mean, I think the first thing is that this is a leadership challenge for first and foremost, and I would like to see, excuse me, a much greater and more explicit commitment from the political level and then from the senior bureaucratic level to recognise the need to protect the space that we've created and then to use it intelligently. And I think we've all agreed over the last few minutes that, you know, there's an intelligent way to do this and a silly way to do it. So let's not do it in a silly way. But I'd love to see this as a much more explicit point of reference from premiers, from ministers, from prime ministers, and then from very senior bureaucrats who say, yep, this is now going to be a leadership challenge for us for the next 18 months to 2 years. That's the first thing. In the public sector, I would like to see, and I raised this in a conversation I had recently on Radio National, where I was asked a similar question with Andy Park on the Drive show, which is quite good fun. And we talked a bit about talent and expertise and the balance between internal talent and expertise and the use of consultants. And I was very open, speaking as a consultant and speaking as somebody who knows a lot of really smart and wonderful people who work in the consulting world. But nonetheless, I'm in the frame. I don't think we've got that balance right at all at the moment. In fact, I think the amount of money we spend on consultants, and the numbers are eye-watering at times, and the amount that we are investing, to go back to Narelle's point, in long-term capability building of expertise and capability inside the public sector, I don't think we've got that right. So as a very pragmatic issue, I'd love to see a much more purposeful desire to spend a little less on external and invest a lot more on internal capability. Because I think, coming back to our triangle, if we're going to play the competence and empathy game, we have to build the internal capability of the public sector itself. And I don't think we've done a terribly good job of that over the last few years.
I couldn't agree with you more. It was excellent. Thank you. No, very good summary points. And thank you for bringing your insights to the table, Martin. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. It's always great to talk about this stuff. It's very lively at the moment. It's great to see people interested in it.
Absolutely. And thank you for the comments that have come from today. And I look forward in the next 6 to 12 months, Martin, having another discussion with you. And
let's see how we go.
Where did this go? Exactly.
Let's see how we go.
Did anyone listen to us?
Yeah, well, indeed. We'll make sure we send everyone the video, obviously. The real question is, the experiment is still going. Yeah. You talked about a live experiment.
Yeah.
The experiment is still going. Believe me, it really is. So I agree. Let's see how it works out in the next phase.
Martin, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Huge pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you. Have a great day.
All the best. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.